everyone, welcome to Adaptive Fashion Vids. Today we're going to learn how to remove pockets and tags. To start, I'm going to go ahead and remove this tag here just to reduce any chance of it causing any kind of skin irritation. So I'm taking a seam ripper. These can be found at any craft store or at a supermarket with a crafting section, usually with the sewing goods. So I'm taking the two prongs and positioning them between the seam and sliding it down, and it's causing the seam to rip. So each thread, I'm taking that and taking it between the seam ripper to cut the thread. Just being careful to avoid my thumb here. These can be a little bit sharp. So I'm pulling it apart just so I can get a better view of the seam here. And I'm cutting that thread and it pops off pretty easily. And then you can take your fingers and just pull apart where the seam was to take the thread off. That's just to make a smoother finish. And here I'm going to show how I removed the tag. I started with a seam ripper, but it was a lot easier to just use the scissors. And as long as you get a close cut to the seam, then the rest of the tag will just tuck up underneath it like that. And now I'm going to take the seam ripper and use it to take off the pocket. And that's just to reduce any kind of pressure points when you're sitting on the pocket. Having those thick seams there can cause some pressure points. So I'm taking my seam ripper and just going along those seams right there as I showed. I'm going to start at the top, and this is the part where there's the most seams. So this is the strongest point of the pocket. So I'm taking my seam ripper and starting there, and I'm just getting the top portions of that. And sometimes it's a little bit easier if you pull it apart and can see the seams between the pocket and the pants, like right there. So I'm going to start just by picking those apart with my seam ripper. So as you go picking those threads apart, it'll be a little bit easier to see where the pocket is still attached to the pant. And I'm moving my seam ripper at angles away from my hand, just being aware of where the pokey parts of the seam ripper are, just to avoid any kind of injury to my other hand. And I'm just pulling that apart and continuing to pick those threads. And once it gets started, I'll start pulling a little bit more. And here I actually pulled a little bit too much and made a tiny hole in the back of the pant. But that's just something to learn from and avoid in the next time. So I don't know if you can see that very well on camera, but it did pull apart a little bit too much. And here the top part of the pocket has come undone, and it's getting a bit easier to pull the seams apart. So I'm just taking my seam ripper and cutting those threads when the pocket stops coming apart very easily. But otherwise I'm just pulling the pocket, and it's not as hard to pull apart now, and it's much lower of a risk of pulling a rip in the jeans because they're not sewn on as tightly here. So I'm just going down and continuing to rip those seams that are holding on still. And I'll just continue to do that all around the pocket. And here I decided to see if the scissors worked better than my seam ripper. I found them to work about the same, so I'm just going to go ahead and pull this apart. And now we're back up to the top of the pocket where there's a lot more seams. So I'm going to be a bit more careful than I was on the other side just to prevent any kind of rips in the jean. So I'm taking my seam ripper and cutting those threads that are still attaching the pocket to the jean. Here I'm just working to position the jean to allow me to best see the threads that are holding the pocket to the jeans. So I'm taking my seam ripper here and cutting, and then trying to take the top of those seams on the top of the pocket apart. And that is very difficult to get between those threads. So I would recommend more looking for what's between the pocket and the jean and cutting those instead of going to the top part. So something similar to what I'm doing here. So eventually you'll cut all of the threads and the pocket can be removed. And then you can take your fingers or tweezers or any kind of tool just to pull those pieces of thread that are remaining on the jean apart. And some of them might be a little bit stuck together, so you can use your seam ripper to pull those apart if you need to. And if it doesn't come apart on one side, just try the other side of the thread. Eventually it'll come apart. And here I'm going to show how to remove a front pocket. For those who are typically in a seated position, long pockets can get bunched up and be uncomfortable. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut these out. I'm starting from the outside to give a hole opening to work on from the inside. And as you can see, there are seams on the inside that connect the jean to the pocket. So I'm only going to cut the pocket material, that white material along that seam, leaving that intact. That way from the outside the jean still looks to be intact and there's nothing visible to indicate that the pocket has been removed. You can really position the jeans to accommodate what feels best for you when you're cutting. So if you're cutting from the inside and you think the better angle would be from the outside, just go ahead and switch it up. That's what I'm doing here just to get a closer cut. Then switching back. And from the outside, you can't tell that this has been cut, but this will prevent any kind of bunching of the pocket. For more information about adaptive fashion and beauty products, please visit the resource page at unitedspinal.org. Thanks for watching.